We're here for another episode of the Hawkins STEM Chronicles, and we're joined by STEM Avenger, Dr. Lauren Gerritsen. Dr. Gerritsen's going to talk a little bit about the early history of vaccines. He's going to give us a straight dope on vaccines.
Vaccines are one of the shining lights of medicine these days. And the history of it grows out of the early history of science. In the 19th century, it was first begun to be learned that bacteria were what caused much of human disease. That hadn't been known before about 1850, but then people started looking at causes of disease. And one of the things that was noted that because smallpox was a disease that affected everywhere in the world large numbers of people. And it was unknown in the Western Hemisphere until the Europeans came here, and then smallpox was the way Europeans conquered the Western Hemisphere. When Cortez came to Mexico City, he landed one night with his men and went out back on the water in the ship, and the next day they came in and they found very little resistance to their conquering Mexico City because smallpox had wiped out the population. So people were interested in getting rid of smallpox. It was epidemic throughout the world. And it was noticed that by an astute British physician that women who were milking cattle did not get smallpox. And they decided it was probably because they all got cowpox, of a mild illness, and that prevented them from getting smallpox. So it was begun to grow and to make and to give cowpox virus to people to see if they would prevent them from getting smallpox, and yes, it did. So immunization against smallpox started in the late 19th century and became a routine part of living for us in this country in the 20th century. Smallpox has essentially not been a part of our society for a very long time. But so it was a very, very successful adventure of giving people smallpox vaccination. Nowadays, there is an immunization against smallpox, which is easily given. And so now we don't give a smallpox vaccination like we did when I was growing up. It's another way, and people will not be. We are close to seeing the complete end of smallpox in the world. But then the real big story of immunizations began in 1920. There was a disease called diphtheria. Diphtheria was a disease caused by a bacteria, and it was passed from person to person. And it was epidemic. In this community, we know of one family of 5 children. All 4 of the 5 were killed within the week of diphtheria. But we also have analyzed the children who died and are buried in our graveyard. And from the community was very young in 1800, very young in 1800. And between 1800 and 1920, children died commonly. There was basically a child buried in our graveyard every week through that period of time of 120 years. But then diphtheria vaccine was developed, and in 1920, because diphtheria was such a rampant disease and of course untreatable, diphtheria vaccination was started. We have not had a death of a child between the age of birth and 15 in our community who was buried in our graveyard since 1920. The vaccination simply ended the diphtheria epidemic. Well, we are still giving all of our children now diphtheria immunization. It's a nice one because it lasts all your life. You just have to give it once, and the body maintains its resistance to diphtheria. Shortly after that, in 1924, the immunization against tetanus was begun. Tetanus was then, and is still now, a completely untreatable illness. Half of everybody who gets tetanus dies. So it was important to people to immunize against tetanus. And it's another bacterial illness, and that we had a vaccine for since 1924. Unfortunately, it doesn't last. So everybody who gets immunized has to be boosted every 7 to 10 years. So now it's routine, and you go into a hospital or frequently into your physician. They'll ask you if your tetanus is up to date. And if it's not, the first thing you do is roll up your sleeve and get ready for a booster. We've been doing that since 1924, and the incidence of tetanus in the United States is very, very low. As a physician, I've never seen a case of tetanus in the United States. When I practiced abroad, I did see it.
Now, I'm going to step back for just a little bit, Dr. Gerritsen. You mentioned the community graveyard. I guess this is probably where we ought to say that we are outside of Washington, D.C., in Sandy Spring, Maryland.
Okay.
And the graveyard you're talking about, and I've been to that graveyard, and it is an incredibly shocking sight to see the graves of innocent young children who were cut. I don't care who you are. If your family's lived in America for 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, you had a family member or a relative who either suffered from yellow fever or suffered from diphtheria or suffered from any number of maladies. And these vaccines were life-saving. I mean, they were just really critical.
We haven't had a death in the United States from diphtheria in years. And here we're losing one child a week for over a century.
And that was the other thing that kind of got me about. Before we started shooting, we were all here talking, and a lot of Americans would not know the term diphtheria, thank God, because the disease has been eradicated because of vaccines.
Well, people all know it because their kids get a DPT shot, and the D stands for diphtheria. So somewhere along they hear the word. Maybe not always, but just get the DPT shot. But it's diphtheria, pertussis, and tetanus.
And I don't think anyone alive, at least in America, has never heard of a tetanus shot.
Yeah. Well, yeah, boy, every time you go into I just went into the hospital to get a cut sewed up in April, and the guy came in. He said, "Is your tetanus up to date?" Everybody gets asked that very same question. I said no. I knew I was about 10 years out. I couldn't remember when it was, but it was at least 10 years ago. So he just goes out and gets me a tetanus shot and walks in with it. And I said, "Sir, let's just make this a celebration."
Yes.
The year is 19 The year is 2024. Tetanus immunization was begun in 1924. This is the 100th anniversary. This is a celebration of 100 years of tetanus.
Well, you know, and it's funny. It's funny that you would mention that because
I think the guy must have thought I was full of bullshit. But
no.
It's because I'm a pediatrician that I even know the date. Now, most physicians wouldn't know that the first tetanus shot was started in 1924, but somehow pediatricians are like to know all these details. It's because the most important thing a pediatrician does for his patients is to immunize them.
Well,
in my book.
And I think, Dr. Gerritsen, you're being too modest. Not only are you a pediatrician, but you are a Maryland pediatrician. And not only are you a local pediatrician, you are a graduate of Johns Hopkins School of Medicine.
Yeah, well.
So, you know,
it was not a unique medical school when I went to it, but it sure was. It sure was 60 years before that. It was the only one in the country.
Well, sir, I want to thank you very much for your time.
Okay.
All right. Have a great day.